Okay, Erev Tov, everybody. I think we can get started. Okay, I lost track of this part 8 or part 9. I forget where we are, but it doesn't really matter. We'll continue with how Tanakh put together, and with a fascinating story and our holiest book, I guess, or how it came into being. So, B'vakasha, Dr. Sokolow.
Okay. So, last week, we moved off the subject of canonization and we moved to the subject of the Masoretic text. So just to remind you, Masoretic is some sort of an anglicized version of the Hebrew word masoret or masorah, which means something that is handed down. Its usual translation is a tradition. And in regards to the biblical text, it refers to the tradition of the proper pronunciation and accentuation of the biblical text. So that we have these different elements. We have the element of the consonantal text. The second element is that of the vocalization, the vowel signs that tell us how to pronounce those consonants. And the third element is called the punctuation or accentuation, and that tells us which words are to be read together as opposed to which words are to be kept separate. So last week, we started the subject of the Masoretic text, and we looked at the physical side of the text. We looked at the different materials on which people wrote in the biblical period, and we ended up looking at the ancient Hebrew alphabet. We're going to pick up this evening with the subject of the alphabet, and that to reintroduce you to a term that we used last week, orthography, with the term orthos meaning straight or correct or proper, and graphos meaning writing. Orthography is the proper way in which to write, and we're going to move from there into the subject of, okay, so now we know what the consonants were like. How were they divided into words? How were the words divided into sentences or verses? And how were the verses divided into paragraphs or parashiot? And ultimately, in the final slide, we'll get to the subject of numerical chapters. So here we go, just to begin and to remind you. Here we have the Hebrew alphabets. On the right side, we have the current Hebrew alphabet, which essentially is the alphabet that has been in use for the last 2,500 years, basically since the beginning or the earliest years of the Second Temple period. And in the second column from the right, we have the what is often called Paleo Hebrew, that is ancient Hebrew, the Hebrew alphabet that was used during the First Temple period. One of the things that we'll see very shortly is a controversy between the two Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud on the one hand and the so-called Palestinian or Jerusalem Talmud on the other hand, with regards to the question of which of these two alphabets is more venerable. You may remember at the close of last week's class, we looked at one scholar's theory of how the letters of the alphabet are grouped together. For example, the first 6 letters all represent the homestead, Aleph, an ox that's found around the farm, so to speak, Bet for the bayit, the house, Gimel for the gamal, the camel, Dalet for the delet, for the door, etc. Another series starting at the bottom of the first column, the next to the last letter, the Yod and the Kaf, and the Lamed having to do with parts of the hand and the arm, Mem from Mayim, water, Nun, the fish, etc. So, I'm sorry, Nun for Nachash and Samach for the fish. So we saw, as I said, we got some sense of what the alphabet was like. we move now into the subject of which of these two alphabets, the Hebrew alphabet that for which we have the earliest evidence during the Second Temple period, or the one for which we have older evidence from archaeological finds. And it's actually a subject, as I said, of a difference of opinion reported in the Talmud. And we have a Talmudic passage here from the tractate Sanhedrin, Amar Mar Zutra v'Item Amar Ukba. Very often Talmudic passages are attributed to more than one authority. Bitchila, once upon a time, Nitna Torah leYisrael bichtav ivri uleshon hakodesh. That initially, the Torah was given to the Jewish people in a script, katav, that's called ivri, and lashon, a language that's called lashon hakodesh. Okay. Chazra v'nitna lahem b'mei Ezra. At a later point in time, the Torah was reissued, so to speak, to the Jewish people during the time of Ezra, which is, as I said, the early part of the Second Temple period. But when the Torah was reissued, it didn't use the Ivri script. It used a script, a ktav called Ashurit. Okay, and instead of being issued in the language, in the Lashon HaKodesh, it was issued in a language called Arami. So what we have here are two different scripts in which the Torah was given. One script is called Ktav Ivri and the other is called Ktav Ashuri, and two languages in which the Torah was given. One language is called Lashon HaKodesh, which is arguably Hebrew, and the other is called Lashon Arami, which is arguably Aramaic. The Talmud continues and it says, Be'reru lahen liYisrael. So given that there were two scripts and two languages, the Jewish people chose one of the two scripts and one of the two languages. Which script did they choose? Ketav Ashurit. They chose to perpetuate the Torah in what was called the Ashurit or Assyrian script, and they chose to perpetuate it in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew. Arguably, that is why our Torah today and our Torah for the last 2,500 years has been written in an alphabet which the Talmud calls the Assyrian alphabet. And again, it's called the Assyrian alphabet because it would appear to have been imported into the land of Israel at the beginning of the Second Temple period by the Jews who returned to the land of Israel from their Babylonian captivity. And another name for Babylonia or Mesopotamia is Assyria. Therefore, the alphabet seems to have been brought by the returnees to Zion with them from their Babylonian captivity. Okay. Now, so what happened to the older script, the alternative script called Ktav Ivri, and the alternative language called Ktav Ashurit? The Talmud says, Hinichu lehedyotot Ktav Ivri uleshon Arami, that the language that wasn't chosen for perpetuation and the script that wasn't chosen for perpetuation were left over for people called hedyotot. Hedyotot is probably a Latin or a Greek word in origin. It means ordinary, common people, and may or may not be related to the word idiot. But the Talmud wants to be more specific. So it asks, man hedyotot, which ordinary or common people are we referring to? Rab Chisda says, Kuta'e, the Kuthians. Kuthians is a Talmudic way to designate the Samaritans. Okay. And indeed, as we know historically, and indeed contemporaneously, the alphabet that is used by the Samaritans is what the Talmud calls Ktav Ivri, the Paleo or ancient Hebrew alphabet. And the Samaritans also, in addition to having the text of the Torah in Hebrew, retain and consider to be sacred the text of the Torah in Aramaic. And finally, the Talmud asks, "My Ktav Ivrit," what is this Ivrit script that was not perpetuated? Rav Chizda once again has the answer. He calls it Ktav Livona'ah. Now, the only word that in Hebrew that seems to resemble Livona'ah is the word Lebanon, Lebanon. Is there any reason why the ancient Hebrew script might be associated with Lebanon? Indeed, there is, because Lebanon was the home of the Phoenicians. And you may remember from our discussion last week, the Phoenicians are generally credited with having invented the alphabet. In fact, it was the Phoenicians who brought the alphabet to the attention of the Greeks. And that is why the Greek alphabet is in fact an alphabet, because the first two characters, alpha and beta, reproduce the aleph and bet of the Phoenician alphabet. Okay. So basically what we have here is an acknowledgement on the part of the Talmud that the alphabet in which Hebrew has been written for the last 2,500 years is not the only alphabet in which Hebrew was ever written. The question that remains, as I said, is which of the two is more venerable? So for that, we move to another passage. In this passage, the Talmud says as follows. You notice on the second line, the highlighted word is not really a word, okay? It's an acrostic. Mem, nun, tzadi, pei, kaf, right? Those letters, tsofim amarum, were prescribed by the lookouts, by the watchmen. Who are the lookouts? Who are the watchmen? Prophets, nevi'im, were known as lookouts, right? There's a passage in the book of Yechezkel where God says to him, "Tzofenet haticha levet Yisrael." God says, "I have made you a lookout for the house of Israel." That is to say, you're the one who's going to see whether trouble is approaching, and you'll be able to warn them of impending trouble. And similarly, the prophet Samuel is referred to as a choseh. Choseh, one who can see, arguably one who can see at a distance, like a watchman or a lookout. So what does the Talmud say? The Talmud says that these letters, Mem, Nun, Tzadi, Pei, and Kaf, were prescribed by the prophets, by the lookouts. What do these letters all have in common? Two things. First of all, these are the 5 letters of the Hebrew alphabet which have 2 forms in written Hebrew. One form, they assume if they appear at the beginning or the middle of a word, but there's an alternative form that these letters assume if they appear at the end of a word. The Hebrew term for that being otiot sofiot, final letters. If a mem appears at the end of the word, it assumes a different shape. Same for the nun, the tzadi, the pei, and the kaf. The other thing that these letters have in common is that when you arrange them in the order in which they're arranged in the Talmud, as opposed, let's say, to the order in which they appear in the alphabet, it actually spells out 2 Hebrew words. Arguably, if you separate the first 2 letters from the last 3, it can read min tzofecha, from your lookouts or from your watchmen. So it might just be a handy mnemonic device for remembering either the letters or remembering who or the authorities who introduced these letters into the Hebrew alphabet. The Talmud then asks itself a question, V'tisbara, is it indeed possible that the prophets introduced letters into the alphabet? V'hakativ, is there not a biblical verse that says, Eila hamitzvot, these are the commandments. And from that, the rabbis deduce she'ein navi reshai lechadesh davar me'ata, that prophets do not have the permission to innovate. Therefore, how could the prophets innovate these 5 final letter forms? Va'od, and moreover, Hamar Rav Chisda, you remember Rav Chisda from the previous text, he's one who seems to have had a particular interest in and maybe some special knowledge of the alphabet. Rav Chisda said as follows: Mem v'samach shebaluchot b'neis hayu omedim. Okay. There's a biblical verse describing the 2 stone tablets on which God engraved the 10 commandments and gave them to Moses. The pasuk says, "V'haluchot ketuvim mishnei evreihem," that the tablets were inscribed on both sides. Mizeh umizeh hem ketuvim. They were written through and through. From this, a certain rabbinic deduction is that somehow the letters of the letters on the luchot, on the tablets, were literally carved through the tablet. Now, that's possible if the letter itself is not completely enclosed. But if a letter that's completely enclosed were to be carved through and through, the fact that the letter was closed meant that the letter should have fallen out. As you see on the bottom of the screen, there is the letter samach in the current Hebrew alphabet, what the Talmud, the previous passage, called Ktav Ashuri, the Assyrian script. The letter samach is completely enclosed, as is the final form of the letter mem. So when Rav Chisda says that the letters mem, the final mem, and the samach of the luchot remained in place miraculously, they were suspended miraculously, he presumes that the shapes of these letters were completely enclosed. Now, if you take a look at the letter mem, okay, if you look here on the 4th line of the text, right, where the letter mem is spelled out, mem, mem, okay, the first mem being the form that the letter takes at the beginning or the middle of the word, and the second mem being the ot sofit, the form that the letter mem takes when it's the last letter in a word, okay? So if you take a look carefully, the letter mem, the initial or middle form of the letter mem is not entirely enclosed, okay? Only the final form of the letter mem is entirely enclosed, which means that according to Rav Chisda, the only one of these 2 mems which had to be suspended miraculously in the luchot would be the final form of the letter mem, not its initial or middle form. But that seems to be a contradiction to the opening statement. The opening statement says that the final form of the letter mem didn't exist until some prophets introduced it. But why would the prophets have to introduce it if the final form of the letter mem was already present in the luchot? So the Talmud actually stumped itself, and when it does, it says, indeed, you're right. Meheve havu. Truly, the final forms of the letters existed as far back as the time of Moses and the 10 Commandments. However, there was a problem. The problem was lo have yadei hai beemtza teva v'hai besof teva, that people forgot which of the 2 forms of the letter is its initial form and which of the 2 forms of the letter is the final form. Va'atut sofim v'takinu, and the prophets are the ones who came and ruled in this question. Pituchin be'emtza teva usetumim besov teva. They're the ones who dictated which forms of the letters belong where. Okay. Now, the curious thing is, as I said, I'll go back for a moment, is that, pardon. Okay. As I said, that Rab Chizda's observation that the mem in the luchot had to be suspended miraculously presumes that we're talking about what we call the final form of the letter mem in the Katav Ashuri, in the Assyrian script. That, of course, would mean that the initial Hebrew alphabet, the one in which God engraved the luchot, was what the Talmud calls Katav Ashuri. The problem arises in the parallel passage that appears in the Jerusalem Talmud. The parallel passage in the Jerusalem Talmud says, Amar Rabbi Levi, the bottom three lines, Mandi Amar l'ra'atz nitna haTorah, according to the one who says that the Torah was given in a particular script called Ra'atz, which is essentially the same script that the earlier Talmudic passage called Ktav Ivri, Ayin Ma'aseh Nisim. If there was any letter of the Hebrew alphabet which had to be suspended miraculously because it was a completely enclosed letter and would otherwise have fallen out, says Rabbi Levi, that was neither the mem nor the samach, but it was the letter ayin. And as you see on the bottom of the slide, the form, the Paleo-Hebrew form, the Ktav Ivri form of the letter ayin is actually a reproduction of the I. It is a completely round or oval letter, completely enclosed. So indeed, what we have here is a machloket, a difference between two Talmuds. And it's very interesting because the Babylonian Talmud is the one that gives priority to the Assyrian alphabet, while the Jerusalem Talmud is the one that gives priority to the Hebrew alphabet. Okay. In any event, how could the alphabet change? How could such a substantial and considerable change take place? The Talmud addresses that too, and it says that it was due to the authority of Ezra. And this is a passage that we looked at previously during one of our discussions of authorship and canonization, and that is the passage that says, Ra'oi haya Ezra shetinaten Torah al yado liYisrael ilmale kedamo Moshe. That Ezra was worthy to have been the intermediary through whom the Torah was given to the Jewish people, had Moses not preceded him. Therefore, essentially, Ezra is the equivalent of Moses. So just as God gave the Torah to Moses in a particular script and in a particular language, so is it possible for God to give the Torah once again to Ezra, even if it meant changing the script or changing the language. And you see at the very bottom of the passage something I already mentioned, Lama Nikra Shurit, why is the script that was used in the Second Temple and is currently in use, why is it called the Assyrian script? She'ala imahem me Ashur, because as I said, it returned to the land of Israel with the Jews from the Babylonian captivity. Now, the fact that eventually the alphabet was agreed upon doesn't mean that everything right away was written the same way. Here we have a passage from a text, which, despite the fact that it's called Masechet Soferim, is not really part of either the Babylonian or the Palestinian Talmud. In spite of its being called a Masechet, it's a post-Talmudic work. but as you can tell from its title, Soferim, it deals primarily and is a source of authority for a lot of details that pertain to the way Torah texts are written. And here the passage says as follows. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, one of the Tanaitic authorities, said, Shlosha sefarim nimtzeu ba'azara, that at some point during the Second Temple period, 3 different scrolls could be found in the temple. One of them is called the Sefer of Ma'on, the second was called the Sefer of Za'atute, and the third was called the Sefer of Hu. And the Talmud explains, Be'echad, in one of these scrolls, Matz'u Katuv Ma'on, they found a biblical verse. It appears at the very end of the Torah, at the end of Moses' blessings to the Jewish people. It's the part of the Torah that we read for the Chatan Torah, for the conclusion of the Torah reading on Simchat Torah. And in our texts, the word is not ma'on, but me'ona. Nevertheless, what this text tells us is that at some point during the Second Temple period, there were Torah scrolls which read the word as ma'on instead of me'ona. Okay. However, it says, Be'echad matzu katov ma'on. Only one of the 3 scrolls had the word written as ma'on. Bishnayim, in the 2 other scrolls, it was written me'ona. So what did the rabbis do? They applied the rule of majority. Kiyamu shnayim ubitlu echad. They upheld the version me'ona that appeared in 2 of the scrolls, and they canceled out or nullified or voided the reading of ma'on, which was found in only 1 scroll. And the same thing happens in another verse that uses the word za'atute or na'are, and the third happens with respect of a verse where the word could be read as either who or he. The particular examples are not significant. As I said, the significance resides in the fact that it tells us that still during the Second Temple period, there were still some discrepancies amongst Torah scrolls. In fact, there are discrepancies that remain even within certain biblical texts. So here, I want to say a word about things alphabetic. Let me share with you a text. Excuse me for a moment here while I'm sorry, I just need to bring it up and then I will share it with you. Here we go. Hello. Okay. So, okay, I trust you can see it. It's the first chapter of the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, okay? I hope you can see, I highlighted the first letter in each verse, so you can clearly see that the first chapter of the book of Eicha is an alphabetic acrostic. That is to say, the first letter of every verse begins with the next consecutive letter of the Hebrew alphabet, okay? Notice that I have highlighted 3 particular verses, right? The ones that begin with the consecutive letters Samach, Ayin, Pei, okay? That indeed is the sequence of the alphabet, of the Hebrew alphabet, as we know it today. The curious thing is that it hasn't always been the sequence of the Hebrew alphabet. In fact, we have to go no further than chapter 2 of the book of Eicha. Chapter 2 of the book of Eicha is also an alphabetic acrostic. But if we look at those same 3 verses, notice that the sequence is no longer Samach Ayin Pei, but the sequence is Samach Pei Ayin. In fact, that sequence remains in chapter 3 of the book of Eicha. Chapter 3 is not merely an alphabetic acrostic. Chapter 3 is a triple alphabetic acrostic. Every letter of the alphabet sequentially is represented by 3 psukim. And notice again that the sequence is not Samach Ayin Pei, but the sequence is Samach Pei Ayin. And that same sequence of Samach Pei Ayin is in the 4th chapter of the book of Eicha as well. So notice, out of 4 alphabetic chapters in the book of Eicha, only the first of the 4 has the alphabet in the sequence that we recognize. 3 of the other chapters have invert the sequence of 2 of the letters of the alphabet. Now, the interesting thing is that it isn't only the book of Eicha that inverted the sequence of the letters of the alphabet. The same inversion, that is to say, Samach Pei Ayin instead of Samach Ayin Pei, appears in many abecedaries. I love the word. An abecedary is essentially the alphabet written out. And archaeologists have recovered numerous abecedaries, very likely exercises taken by people who were learning to write the alphabet. And not all of them, not even most of them, but a few of these abecedaries have the same inversion of the 2 letters. Samach Pei Ayin instead of Samach Ayin Pei, leading us to infer that just as that at some point in time, the sequence of the Hebrew alphabet was still in flux, and that the book of Eicha would seem to capture a moment in time in which, if you said Samach Pei Ayin instead of Samach Ayin Pei, people wouldn't jump on you and say, "What's the matter? Don't you know the letters of the alphabet?" But they would say, "Oh, Samach Pei Ayin, yeah, we know that there are people who have the letters in that sequence." What I want to do on that basis is make a suggestion. That is, let's look together at another biblical text that is written in an alphabetic acrostic. Let's look at the 34th chapter of the book of Tehillim. You may recognize it. It's part of Psukei de Zimra of Shabbat morning. LeDavid b'shanoto et ta'abo lifnei Avimelech, something ostensibly composed by King David when he was living amongst the Philistines. Notice again, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samach, Ayin, Pei, Sadi. Oh, that's the correct sequence of the alphabet. Yes, but now look at the 4 highlighted verses. Okay, it says, actually, we can go back 1 to 2 verses. Okay, particularly because I like the rabbi's son's song Mi Ha'ish Hechafetz Chayim. Okay, so it says Mi Ha'ish Hechafetz Chayim Ohev Yamim Lirot Tov. Who is a man who seeks life, who loves longevity, and wants everything to be good? What's the formula? The formula is Nitzor Lishoncha Meira. Guard your tongue from speaking evil, usvatecha, and your lips midaber mirma, from speaking treacherously. Sur meira, same advice, right? Avoid things that are bad or wicked. Aseh tov, do things that are proper. Bakei shalom v'rodfehu, seek out peace, and pursue it. Okay, so remember, the advice here is that there are two poles. There's the good and the bad. You should avoid the bad and seek the good. Okay, now it says as follows. Einei Hashem el tzadikim ve'oznav el shavatam. God's eyes, meaning who does God look out for? God looks out for the people who do good, the righteous people. He keeps his eye on them, right? And he's always attentive to hear whether they need help. Sounds good, okay? Let's go on. Pnei Hashem, which means God's angry face, ba'osei ra, right? Just as God keeps an eye out and an attentive ear to help those who are righteous, God turns an angry face to those who pursue wickedness, lahachrit me'eretz zichram, to eradicate all memory of them from the earth. Now, what does it say in the next verse? Tza'aku, if they cry out, Vashem shamea, God will hear them, umikol tzarotam hitzilam, and he will spare them from all of their troubles and misery. Huh? I thought it just said 2 verses ago that God keeps an ear out for the cry of the righteous people, and that God turns an angry face at the wicked people, and he eradicates them. So why are you now telling me, but if they call out to God, he listens to them and he saves them? Now, of course, the medieval commentators looked at this, they saw the problem, and they said, oh, of course, in between verse 17 and verse 18, there's something missing. What's missing? They did tshuva, right? That, of course, if they remain wicked, God will eradicate them. If, however, they do tshuva, if they repent, then if they repent and they call out to God, so God will be kind to them. What if the letters of the alphabet here were inverted the same way that they are inverted in those 3 chapters in the book of Eicha, and the way that they are inverted in those abecedaries? You know what we'd have? We'd have this. Avoid evil, do good. Why? Because God's anger is directed to those who are wicked in order to eradicate them, while God's providence is directed to those who are righteous, and he is attentive to their call. Therefore, tza'aku, if they, the righteous, call out, God will surely hear them and will spare them from all of their distress. Just a thought. Okay. That can take us back now to our PowerPoint. I called that alphabetic hijinks. Okay. So, as it says, some acrostic psalms are technically imperfect. For example, Psalm 9 and Psalm 10 appear to constitute a single acrostic psalm together, but the length assigned to each letter is unequal, and 5 of the 22 letters are not represented at all. In Psalm 25, 1 Hebrew letter is not represented. The letter following Resh, right? The following letter Resh is repeated. In Psalm 34, etc. Psalm 37, whatever it is, okay? Psalm 111 and 112, each has 22 lines, right, for the number of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet, but only 10 verses. Psalm 145, that's Ashrei, does not have a verse representing the letter Nun, having a total of only 21 verses, but a Qumran manuscript of Psalm 145 has the missing line.
Please share
So
your
here
screen.
is the Dead Sea Psalm scroll. And I'm going to try to read it with you, okay?
No, nothing is showing.
Right, your screen is blank. I don't know if that's, I assume that's a mistake.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, there we go.
So
Thank you.
here is the Dead
Okay.
Sea Psalm scroll of Psalm 145, Ashrei. Okay, notice on the first line, underlined in red. Okay, I don't know if you can make it out.
Nope, no, 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 no.
Mem Lamed, right? Chaf Vav Tav Chaf Hey Malachutcha. It's a strange spelling, right? But it can be read Malachutcha, Malachut, Kol Olamim, Umem Shaltecha. Moving to line 2, Bechol Dor Vador. Okay. Skip for a moment what's underlined in orange and move to the end of line 2. Okay. Ne'eman, line 3, Elohim b'devarav v'chasid b'chol ma'asav. Okay. That is the verse that is, well, arguably the verse that's missing from Ashrei. The verse beginning with the letter Nun. Okay. Now, actually, this Dead Sea Scroll is not a biblical scroll. It's a liturgical scroll. That is to say, it wasn't even written for the purpose of representing a biblical text. It was written for the purpose of representing a text to be used in prayer. How do I know? Because of the refrain that occurs after every verse. The one that you see here in the middle of line 2. Baruch Hashem uvaruch shemo leolam va'ed. That refrain, blessed is God and blessed be his name forever and ever, is in this text following every single verse. And that, as I said, is reasonably conclusive evidence that this was not written as a biblical text, but rather as a liturgical text, which means that it doesn't prove that there was originally a verse in Ashrei that started with the letter Nun, but it means that somebody made up a verse beginning with the letter Nun for a liturgical, a prayerful purpose. Notice something else, by the way. The name of God, right, as it's spelled out here on line 2, at the end of line 3, and in the middle of line 4, okay? Trust me, those are the letters Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. But if you don't recognize them, it's because they're not written in Ktav Ashuri, they're written in Ktav Ivri. This is another one of the idiosyncrasies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that whenever they write the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God, apparently it was taboo not only to pronounce the name, but it was taboo even to write it. And therefore they wrote it in kind of like a backhanded fashion by using the letters of the ancient Hebrew alphabet. Okay. So now we've gone from the letters, from the alphabet, the consonantal text, to the question of how is the text itself divided? How is it divided into words? How are the words divided into sentences? How are the sentences divided into paragraphs? How are the paragraphs divided into chapters? So first of all, we have a Talmudic passage that tells us "Lefichach nikra'u rishonim soferim," that if you want to know why some of the ancients were called sofrim, right? The answer is shahayu soferim kol ha'otiyot shebatorah. Now, bear in mind, you see the little notation on the bottom of the left-hand side of the text. The word sofrim can mean counters as well as scribes, okay? This preserves in English in Hebrew, the same ambivalence that exists in English. If you think about it in English, the word counting and the word accounting, right? If you go to the bank, the person whom you give your money to or take your money from is called a teller. right? And the same duality is preserved in several European languages. You may know this from German, or you may know it from the equivalent in Yiddish. Zählen is to count. Erzählen is to tell a story. Okay, so indeed, what we have here, it's like a double entendre. Why were the ancients called soferim, meaning that they either wrote the letters of the Torah text or counted the letters of the Torah text? Because they knew exactly how many letters there were. Therefore, they were able to identify which letter is the middlemost letter in the entire Torah, and that they said was the letter Vav in the word Gachon, appearing in a verse in the book of Vayikra. And they were able to tell us that the words darosh, darash were the exact middle of the Torah, counting not letters, but counting words, and that the word v'hit galach was the middle of the Torah if we were counting not letters and not words, but we were counting verses or sentences. Now, in ancient texts, by and large, words were separated from each other by dots. That, as you see at the explanation on the bottom, is because in the absence of vowel signs, Hebrew, any combination of 3 letters can pretty much make up a word. Therefore, the usual practice was to use dots to separate them so that you'd know which consonants belong to the first word, as opposed to which consonants now belonged to a second word, okay? In Latin, however, which has internal vowel signs, right? A, E, I, O, U, whole words could be identified at a glance, and therefore in ancient manuscripts, ancient Latin and Greek manuscripts, the letters were just simply written continuously, no spacing and no dots placed between them. Our traditional Sefer Torah uses spacing, a method that was already found in late Aramaic inscriptions. However, the Samaritan Bible preserves the older alternative method so that individual words are separated from each other with a single dot, and sentences, verses, are separated from each other by double dots. Now, insofar as the division into verses is concerned, the Talmud records a difference of opinion between the early Amoraim, Rav and Shmuel, concerning the question of whether it is permissible or prohibited to divide Torah verses in an untraditional manner. Okay, Rav said as follows: Kol psuka de la paskei Moshe, any division into verses that was not already made by Moses, anan lo paskinan le, we do not permit ourselves to make such divisions. Shmuel amar paskinan le, Shmuel disagreed, and he said it's perfectly all right. By the way, this machloket of Rav and Shmuel plays itself out at many Shabbos tables every Friday night. Why? Because how does Kiddush start on Friday night? Kiddush on Friday night starts with Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Yom HaShishi. However, if you take a look in the Torah text, that's not a full verse. That's half a verse. So, according to Rav, who says that it's prohibited to make divisions in biblical verses that weren't sanctified by Moses, you can't just say Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Yom HaShishi, and that's why some people have the custom of starting at the beginning of the verse. Vayar Elohim et kol asher asa v'hinei tov ma'od, right? That God looked about at everything that he had created and it was really good. Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Yom HaShishi. Other people, I would surmise probably most people, right? Because that's the way it's printed in the Siddur, just simply start with Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Yom HaShishi, which at least according to Shmuel is perfectly all right. Okay. How about the division of sentences into paragraphs? So the Torah is divided into paragraph-like blocks of text, each of which is called a parashah. The word lifrosh means to separate, and therefore a parashah means a separate entity. So every so often, biblical verses are combined together into a parashah, into a separate literary unit. In a Torah scroll, there are two kinds of parashiot. And here you might not be able to make out the text, but it's perfectly clear in terms of the spacing, right? Let's just take the middle column, okay? Notice that after the first 8 lines or so, there's a line that ends in the middle, and the remainder of the line is blank. That's an open space, and therefore that parasha, that paragraph is called petucha, open. Look 5 lines from the bottom of the text, and here you see that the first word on the line ends the previous parasha, right? But the next parasha starts on the same line after a considerable space is left. Therefore, that space is not an open space because it's enveloped on both sides, and therefore that parasha is called a parasha setuma, a closed parasha. So those are the 2 different kinds of parashiot, or paragraphs, into which the Torah text is divided, and not only the Torah text, but all biblical texts, at least all biblical texts as they are written on scrolls. Now, how many parashiot are there? Here's where we get into a bit of a problem, okay? And I'm just going to pose the problem now, and I'm not going to resolve it until next week. The question is, if you count up, let's go back to the previous slide for a moment. If I wanted to know how many parashiot, or how many paragraphs there are in the Torah, all right, I mean, it'll take me a while to do it, but it's really a mechanical task. All I have to do is go back to the beginning of Bereshit, and I have to count how many paragraphs there are, bearing in mind that some of the paragraphs will be petuchot, open, some of the paragraphs will be setumot, closed. But if I simply keep track of all of the parashiyot petuchot and all of the parashiyot setumot, then the total will be the number of parashiyot, or paragraphs, in the Torah. That's not, however, how we customarily use or conventionally refer to a parasha. Convention refers to a parasha not as a paragraph, a discrete paragraph on a Torah scroll, but convention uses the word parasha to designate the amount of Torah text that's read on a particular Shabbat. Okay, that's why the Torah text for this week is called Parashat HaShavua. Okay. It should already occur to you that there are more paragraphs in the Torah text than there are weekly parashiot. Every weekly Torah reading consists of several parashiot. But let's start now just with the simple question of how many weekly parashiot are there? So what I'd like you to do, the answer is here so you can find it yourselves, but maybe you want to test yourself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the share, okay? So if you want to go back to the text, it's there. If you'd like to, take the Parashah challenge and see if you can make a list of all of the parashiot, of all of the weekly Torah readings. And what I'd like you to think about is, how many are there? Now, it should be a very easy question, meaning you shouldn't even have to say, well, Bereshis, I got to think about it. First Parsha is Bereshis, the second one is Noach, the third one is Vayera, or in Sefer Bimidbar, the first one is Bimidbar, and the second one is Naso, and the third one is Bahalotcha. It should be very easy, right? We call it Parashat HaShavua, the weekly Torah reading. So it should be very easy. How many parashiot are there? The answer is as many as there are weeks. So how many weeks are there? That's a trick question. Why is it a trick question? Because the question of how many weeks are there in a year depends upon what kind of a year I'm talking about. Because there are a different number of days and therefore a different number of weeks in a solar year than there are days and weeks in a lunar year. So what I'd like you to think about, if you were trying to take the Parashah challenge, is to make a list of all of the parashiyot in the Torah and see if you can somehow reconcile the total number of parashiyot with what ought to be the total number of weeks in a year. And we'll start with that next week. Let me take a quick look at the chat. Oh, for some reason, my chat thing is going crazy and I can barely read it.
You want me to read them for you?
No, I see this is just a comment. Stalin's Yiddish alphabet, Yimach Shemo. This is also the mnemonic for the mitzvot that Moshe needed Hashem's help to remember.
Mansapach. You're talking about Mansapach.
Yeah.
I don't know that mnemonic either. I don't know. Menorah.
No.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, Debbie.
Yeah,
Not sure.
Menatzpach. It's menorah, it's Salafcha.
I mean, Kiddush, Chodesh. I mean, they have the different ones.
No, it's Pinchas. Those 5 things that he didn't know what to do is also known as Menatzpach. It's the same thing.
I got to think about that. It's nice. I mean, I'm not sure that it's accurate. I mean, one of them would have to be the Mekoshesh.
Right.
Okay. I'm just trying to start the other way around. Think of all those things that Moses was, flustered and couldn't come up with an answer. Okay. Thank you. That's the part of the joy of teaching is when you learn from the students. Thank you. Okay. Samach and Pei are half rounded. Okay, that's all right. I mean, there are in both alphabets that are letters that are partially enclosed, but nonetheless, in the Assyrian alphabet, the Mem and Samach are the only letters that are completely enclosed. Okay, very good.
Okay, I think it's more interesting to do the Eretz Yisrael Parsha. This Parsha stuff is simple.
We'll get there too.
That's the 54 and the leap years and the double Parsha. That's already that we know. But getting to the 100 and whatever Parsha. By the way, if I'm not mistaken, Vayetze is the only Parsha in the Chumash that is one Parsha. I mean, I know Vayetze is. I just don't know if there are any other. In other words, Vayetze is just one parsha of the one paragraph, as you would call it. It's the only parsha, I think, in the Chumash. If you correct me if I'm wrong, but which in itself is fascinating. That's really that's the best way to learn Chumash. But nobody learns it that way. To study it parsha by parsha, nobody studies it that way. Like when I say parsha, I don't mean Parshat HaShavua. We mean the parsha breaks within the Parshat HaShavua.
Yep, we'll get
Anyways,
there.
yeah, okay,
We will
yeah,
get
we'll
there,
get
for
there. Yeah,
sure.
okay. Tomorrow night, Rabbi Daniel Karapkin from BAYT here in Thornhill, Toronto, whatever, the city of Vaughan, the city above Toronto. Okay, will be the past president of the Rabbinical Council of America will be giving the parsha here tomorrow night at 8:30, And then I will be giving my sitter class back 9 o'clock Friday morning. Remember, at 9 o'clock. And we're going to go back to where we left off before Hanukkah interrupted so nicely. We're going to go back to Birchat HaShachar, and then we'll continue next week with our regular shiurim with Rabbi Leibowitz Sunday morning. We're working, as I mentioned before, we're working on our winter schedule. The fall's coming to an end soon. And anyways, happy to hear your input, and please invite a friend. This is, come join in, and everybody have a wonderful night, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So, no clash, Shuli, she finished her series, but please God, we'll pick up in January with another series, and we'll keep you busy. Okay, everybody, be well.